Today, Debunking Myths About Florida's History. A new podcast unspools false historical narratives about the original inhabitants of Florida. Plus, 5 great crime writers reveal their MO. Then, a life-saving donation that would otherwise be thrown away. Joining me today, Dr. Denise Bossy, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Florida. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Jennifer Gray, Public Services Coordinator for the FSCJ Library System. Welcome.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. On the line, Brendan Rivers, formerly of WJCT's Adapt, but now host and producer of the podcast, Bygone Jax, our Unsung History. Hey, Brendan.
Good morning, Ian.
Good morning. And to our listeners, what were you taught about the history of Native people in Northeast Florida? We want to hear what you learned and how your perspective may have changed. Please join our conversation. Call us at 549-2937. Tag us on X at FCC On Air or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on the Facebook and Instagram apps. So November is Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. Brendan, I'd like to start with you. Could you explain what the Bygone Jax podcast is and how it evolved?
Sure. So it's a partnership with Florida State College of Jacksonville. Jennifer and I have been working on this podcast for quite a while now, and basically what we're trying to do is find bits and pieces of our local history that either don't sort of get the recognition that we think they deserve, or maybe, as is the case with this group of 3 episodes, we're trying to kind of correct the record. There are a couple of stories that we tell ourselves about Jacksonville that may not necessarily be true, or maybe missing certain details. So we're kind of trying to correct that with these episodes.
So the new 3-part series focuses on debunking myths around the original inhabitants of Florida. Dr. Bossy, this is also the focus of your research. So why is the debunking necessary?
That's a wonderful question. When we go into our local museums and state and national parks, a lot of what we read about our local Indigenous people is missing a lot of information and is often framed in a way that presents Indigenous people as not really actors with their own deep histories that predate colonization, and also not as people who shaped French and Spanish colonialism in the region. So debunking myths is really the place we have to begin, by taking what people think that they know, either through schooling or public spaces where people really try to present Indigenous history in a meaningful way, but are lacking the resources. And we begin there in order to then tell this much deeper, more continuous, more holistic history of the Indigenous past and present. And that is a lot of it, too. When we erase Indigenous actors from the past, we also simultaneously erase Indigenous survivants in the present.
And so how did the myths fill this space in the first place?
So a lot of these myths were created in the early 20th century, so over a century ago, as a way for Jacksonians, for local residents, to sort of include a bit of the Indigenous past, but also, frankly, to erase and minimize it, and instead to highlight their own stories about Jacksonville. So part of what we're trying to do is expand, our understanding of who constitutes a resident of Jacksonville and how long this space has actually been occupied and shaped by Indigenous people. And if we look at Indigenous history, in fact, 97% of our human history is Indigenous, if we look at the timeline. So we're missing that 97% when we only sort of begin in the 18th or 19th centuries by telling our past. We're missing all of that.
You allude in this podcast to the Chamber of Commerce kind of history. I don't think that's what you label it, but sort of a historical perspective that tries to present the sunny side and maybe was not just about pure history, but also about boosterism.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we see, especially in the 1920s and 30s, with the creation of the Historical Society and a real interest in sort of beginning to think about attracting tourists to Florida, an emphasis on the Indigenous past as a very distant past, sort of a romantic, very distant past that doesn't have much to do with the present, and that's portrayed in a particular way, right, to market the area.
Jennifer Gray, as a research librarian, you've done a tremendous amount of research on this project. Tell us about the people known as the Timucua, named for, I believe, the language that they spoke rather than how they self-identified.
That's correct. So we don't really know what the Timucua called themselves. So Timucua is sort of a phrase that I believe was first applied by Europeans and has been adopted by scholars as a way to easily refer to these people since we don't know their self-identification. And they were here going back several hundred years before Europeans arrived. Before that, there were pre-Timucua tribes who are not necessarily the same tribe. We don't know, I don't think, enough about them to say specifically how they identified either, but we have indigenous history in this area going back about 12,000 years, I believe, and a lot of that is just not represented in the records that we see normally.
And you also talk in this podcast about the Mocama. Explain how they are a subset of the Timucua.
So Mocama is a dialect of the Timucua language. And so that's how the local area around the city of Jacksonville, they were speaking a specific dialect known as Mocama, was called that way by the Spanish. And that's how we identify the local tribe as opposed to, I believe, one slightly to the south, closer to St. Augustine is Agua Dulce. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Mocama actually means the sea. It is a Timucua word. And so it's the word for the dialect they spoke. And so we do know the names of their towns. We know what they called themselves in that sense. We also know some of the names of their clans, which were really important identifications. We don't know what they called themselves collectively as a group. But the Mocama are what Keith and I use as an umbrella term for indigenous people in our area who had in the 16th century a kind of loose political affiliation. They were comprised of numerous towns who affiliated for sort of foreign affairs and were webbed together by kinship ties, especially through marriage, through women.
Brendan, in the podcast, these 3 episodes of Bygone Jax, one of the myths that you puncture is that of the fabled city of Osachite, if I'm saying that correctly, if anybody is saying that correctly.
We don't know.
Right. Before I ask you to tell me that story, though, let's hear a little sound from the interview. You're speaking here to Gerald Milanich, Curator Emeritus at the Florida Museum of Natural History.
I don't think there was such a place in Jacksonville, but I'd be wrong before. And if someone can come up with a good map that shows the site there, that would be interesting. But I don't think it exists. I've looked at, every old Spanish map of Florida over the last 30 or 40 years, and I just think that it's an error or somebody put it in as a joke or something. Who knows?
Brendan, what is the story with this fabled city on the banks of the St. Johns River?
To put it bluntly, there's no evidence that Osachite actually existed. So we kind of built the podcast to explain sort of how this myth could have come about, and what we think may have led to the story of Osachite is this map that is actually on display in the library. I believe it's still there. And if you look at the map, there's Florida, and then there's a river in the northeast. And then if you look closely, you can see the name of a town called Osachile, with an L, not a T. And that was an actual Timucua town, but that was quite a bit west of Jacksonville. But we think Davis or maybe someone before him might have seen that map, maybe misread it, and then came to the conclusion that there was this town in Jacksonville. But at this point, there is no archaeological evidence and nothing in the Spanish or French records to indicate that there was an indigenous town where downtown Jacksonville now sits.
And according to the podcast, this town would have basically been at the foot of Liberty Street at the river, that kind of area. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, I got a kind of a funny story about where it is. So there's a historical marker supposedly indicating where it is right next to the state attorney's office. And in episode 1, at the top of the episode, we used some nat sound because I actually went out there to record so people could hear what it sounds like in that spot right now. And I guess they have some security cameras outside the state attorney's office. And the sheriff's office thought I was trying to listen in on a case or something. So some police kind of came, and I got a call, and they were investigating me for a little bit just to make sure I wasn't doing anything a little sketchy. But so that's where it is, right there next to the state attorney's office. That's where it's supposed to have been.
You looked suspicious out there with your fuzzy microphone and your, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that it raises an interesting point, Dr. Bossy. This history that is so questionable is actually enshrined in a historical marker. How does that happen?
It happens the same way we have statues to different folks, right? That we grab something from the past and pull it into the present and say that it makes our space special in some way, right? So I think in this case it was the Daughters of the American Revolution who enshrined this in the 1930s in a plaque. Maybe Jennifer can talk more about that.
Yeah, I believe this was placed by the Jacksonville Historical Society at the same time that T. Frederick Davis would have been part. And T. Frederick Davis is the author of what is considered, I believe, to be the main history of Jacksonville, which is History of Jacksonville vicinity 15-something to 1924, which is largely relied upon by most people as the primary history because it is public domain. It's easily accessible. It's free online. And Davis was very active in the local historical society, and he's the first one that we found who referred to this Osaquite, theoretically. And just a footnote, it's like 2 lines in his magnum opus, which is 800 pages long. And we think that that's probably why they put it there, is because he thought it existed. He was part of this society, and then just the marker went up. Now, to be fair, as one of the things we discuss in this podcast is, while there was an element likely of romanticizing the past here, it's also just possible that, as you go along and study history and archaeology, you uncover more and more facts as the years progress. So it could have also been partially an honest mistake that just ballooned into something more.
Yeah, so Davis is part of a much larger phenomenon that happens beginning in the late 19th century across the United States, especially the East Coast, where local historical societies are established by citizens who are very interested in taking an imagined indigenous past and present for their own purposes, right? To tell, in fact, their own origin stories. So a lot of these from, Massachusetts to Florida, these local historical societies, these first histories are written by people who begin with an indigenous past, an imagined one, and then replace that past with their own story of origin. So a scholar, Jean O'Brien, has studied this really well. It's called Firsting and Lasting, her book, if you're interested in it. And it looks at this phenomenon, and it very much applies to what Davis was doing in Jacksonville, to what other folks were doing in St. Augustine, taking an imagined, invented indigenous past and then quickly shifting, so it's a footnote, shifting to sort of 19th century colonial settler narratives to displace that notion of this having been an indigenous space.
And so in the scope of history, indigenous people have like you said, 14,000 years or so history when the French arrive in the 1560s. So they're about 10,000 years late to the game, right?
Correct, yes.
And yet most of our histories...
That's what written records will do for you. That's part of the problem I think Dr. Bossy addresses when we talk to her on the podcast, is that there can be an oral tradition, but that requires having people around who are part of that oral tradition who you can talk to. Or if there is none of that to look at, then what you're left with is whatever written records are left by the people who were here. And unfortunately, in this case, it's largely the Spanish and the French who have a very particular viewpoint regarding the local indigenous people. So when the histories get written, they get written relying on written records by people who have certain biases because they came here to colonize the land.
It's often said, history is written by the victors. But part of what you found, Brendan, in this podcast is that there's almost an attempt to suggest that people are not in existence anymore, that there is this belief that the tribes really were completely eradicated or left. And how does that play into the desired narrative, Brendan?
Yeah, so that's a really common myth when you talk about indigenous history around the country. It's called the terminal narrative, and it's the idea that the people who are native to a specific area are gone or they're extinct, and therefore when European colonizers come or when later American governments start settling, that they're not taking the land from anybody, that the land is available for them. And that really erases all of that history that we've been talking about and the territoriality of these groups who never ceded their land or signed treaties giving up their land to colonizers or to the United States government. And by doing that, we're just erasing all of this fascinating history and kind of forgetting about the people that were here so much longer before we were.
I want to take a call from Eric. He's calling us from Arlington. I believe he's been waiting for a minute. Good morning, Eric. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is not what I called about, but when you were speaking a second ago about replaced histories, it sort of reminded me that the daughters of the American Revolution, how deep their sort of reimagining history, indeed here in Jacksonville, was so eminent if anyone's ever been to Fort Caroline, this is sort of indigenous people adjacent, I suppose. If you've ever been to Fort Caroline, you could see that there is a stele up there on Ribault Point, I guess it's called, and it commemorates the landing of the French, and it was sponsored by the Dollars of the American Revolution, or Dollars of the Confederacy, I'm sorry. And it occurs to me that they were really, the Dollars of the American, or Dollars of the Confederacy were sort of hell-bent on sort of making a big deal about the French and the fact that they were at Fort Caroline. And I think the reason for this is because they were Protestant. And so, they weren't Catholics like the Spanish. And so it's just interesting that the history has sort of been biased against the Spanish here in Jacksonville itself and toward the French, who were only here for, a year. Anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the call. Dr. Bossy, what do you say about that?
I'm so glad you asked about that. So I'm embarking and have already started a big project with Dr. Keith Ashley, who's the archaeologist at the University of North Florida who specializes in local Indigenous archaeology, and I'm the historian who specializes in local Indigenous history. And we've actually created an Indigenous walking tour of Fort Caroline that you can pull up on your phone, so that as you walk around Fort Caroline, you can actually learn a lot about the Mocama history of that space. So Fort Caroline was actually established with permission by Mocama Indians, especially Saturiwa, whose name we see all around Jacksonville. And that was smack in the middle of Mocama territory. So we've done what we can to really help fill out that narrative. And I encourage everybody to go to our website. It's Indigenous Florida. If you Google that, you'll come up on our website. You'll see the first component of that. The first tour is this walking Indigenous tour of Fort Caroline. But absolutely, there is definitely a religious component to this, to focusing in our region still to this day on kind of that notion of the Protestant narrative of the French who are here for less than 2 years. And yeah, I think that still is part of why that memorialization still occurs so often across our city.
We've also got a question from Mark in St. Augustine. Good morning, Mark. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. Like the Timucua, I was born and raised in Jacksonville, and I had the mandatory fourth grade education about the history of Florida and the history of Jacksonville, Duval County. And we had a lot of stuff about the Timucua Indians, I remember, but we never went into what actually happened to them. Did they all die off from disease, or did we kill them all, or did we send them into slavery, or what exactly?
Good question. Who wants to pick that up?
So the best thing I could say is spoilers. Maybe you should listen to the podcast. We do address that directly. But I think a combination of factors were at play, including disease, including slaving that we talk about, and then also just a tiny hint, maybe they're not as gone as you think they are. And I'll leave it there because I don't want to spoil the ending of the final podcast.
Dr. Bossy.
I'm okay with spoilers. So absolutely, they don't sort of go away, go extinct. A word that I often call paleontological, right? A concept that we use to apply to dinosaurs and shouldn't use when we think about indigenous people or any people. So, we go into the deeper history of this, but essentially we are limited by archives, right? So what the Spanish know is often what we know, and we have to go beyond those archives to find examples of indigenous survivance. But even in those archives, we can find Mocamas moving to live among the Creeks. We can find Mocamas living among the people who become the Seminoles. And today, the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma and the Seminole Tribe of Florida both claim Mocamas and other indigenous people. We have actually more diverse indigenous history than we often recognize. They claim them all as ancestors. So they are not gone. The polities are gone, right? The political organizations are gone, but the humans are not gone. And we have to make that distinction, I think, when we talk about our local indigenous people. And that narrative that Brandon was talking about, that terminal narrative, is just not true. It's something that the Spanish begin to perpetrate because they don't know the space. They don't know the history. They're limited. We see the English and then the Americans sort of pick up that story of not really understanding who's still living here by the 18th and 19th centuries. And we see that in their documents that there are, in fact, people beyond the reach of their small cities and towns. that they're just not documenting very well. So that's where we historians and archaeologists come in and fill in all of that information. And some of that's in the podcast, and there'll be more of that in the book that Dr. Ashley and I are writing right now together.
And we should mention that because you and Dr. Keith Ashley recently won a very prestigious grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tell us about that grant. What is it, and what does it allow you to do? You were just one of a handful of people who got this kind of funding.
Yeah, we won one of the bigger NEH grants. It's a 3-year grant for collaborative research. It's $250,000, which in history money, I always talk about history money. For historians, that's like an unbelievable amount of money because we're used to sort of $5,000 grants here and there. So we're one of 20 groups around the nation who've won one of these big collaborative research grants. It gives us 3 years of funding to do things like have time to do the research, have the resources to go and travel. Part of our work is really partnering with indigenous nations who are connected to this space. So the Muskogee Creeks, for example, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and others. So it allows us to travel. It allows us to hire students to work with us. It just allows us to do all sorts of amazing work and to really make this book, which is going to be a deep and continuous history of the indigenous past and present of Jacksonville, to really make this book the best that it can be. And it's going to be a public-facing book. So it's going to include cutting-edge scholarship, but be very accessible to a broad range of people so that teachers and museum educators and anyone who's interested in local history can pick this book up and understand the really continuous deep history of our region that's over 13,000 years old.
And you're going to have to help me with the pronunciation of the title.
Heka Utamile.
Meaning?
It means our land in Timucua. There's actually a language group that's reconstructed under Dr. Aaron Broadwell of University of Florida. He's a linguist. He's reconstructed the Timucua language. So that means our land. And it's a very exciting moment in the history and the linguistics and archaeology of our region. There are just a lot of people coming together to understand our indigenous past.
Brendan, you've reported in Florida for a long time now. Teaching uncomfortable history seems to be getting more difficult, not less, in Florida.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think this is just limited to historical topics either. I think humans tend to like to look at things as being very black or white. And when we talk about history and science too, a lot of people tend to think of things as just a series of unchanging facts. But that's just not the case. I mean, we are constantly learning more about history and about science. And when we learn those new things, the consensus about what's happening shifts to account for that new information. And then when that new take on things tries to get communicated to the public, a lot of times there's like this really emotional pushback. And I really hope one of the main takeaways from this podcast is that people will kind of approach these things with more of an open mind and realize that even the experts don't know everything about these topics. We're always learning more things, and that's not a bad thing. And you can learn a lot more if you kind of take that more open-minded approach to these topics.
We have a caller, I believe Kate on line 2 wants to talk about that very history. Good morning, Kate, and welcome to First Coast Connect.
Good morning. I wanted to let your listeners know that we have a very important opportunity tonight. It's the City Council meeting tonight, and Dean Black, the legislator in Florida, is about to railroad a bill through that will be passed, probably without a doubt, in March if we don't do something about this. He wants to make it illegal to take anything having to do with anything Confederate, illegal to take them down. And we have the Women of the Southland Monument put up by people with ties to the KKK, and we need to get that monstrosity down. And tonight is a perfect opportunity. There's going to be a press conference at 4 o'clock. Then the City Council meeting starts at 5. You don't have to speak at the City Council. If you just show up and wear black, you'll be doing us a huge favor.
All right, Kate, thanks for that. So history is messy.
Very messy.
Explain for us what do people not understand about the way that history is researched and told?
So one of the things that I have definitely learned across this project is, one, beware simple stories. Simple stories are usually, even if unintentionally, deceptive. Because as we say, history is very messy. It's complicated. There are lots of factors. There are lots of voices. And if you get a very 1, 2, 3 simple story, there's probably something being left out. Even as we were writing the podcast, we had to be cautious because you're trying to synopsize something. And if you use the wrong word, you're accidentally misleading people. in a way that can, again, create a false narrative. So there were a lot of times, and even in the editorial process, somebody was like, this line is way too long, Jennifer, you need to cut it down. And I was like, yes, but if we do, we're saying something that's wrong. So it can be difficult. It's very, very difficult to streamline something that makes it easy enough for people to understand who do not maybe have the academic background of having done all the archaeology themselves, having looked at all the documents themselves, and yet still hew close enough to the truth that it is not misleading in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Like, history is difficult. Dr. BC knows this.
Well, and I think it has to do with how often children are taught that history is a collection of facts that are neutral rather than what history really is, which is people's experiences, often shared experiences of the past. And even if we look at our own families, like my sister's memories of our childhood are very different from my memories of our childhood. And so we are often pushed to come up with factual content and a singular narrative that tells us who we all are by looking at our past, rather than the way that history really functions, which is competing, different, conflicting, parallel narratives of the past that don't have to be brought together into a singular point of view and shouldn't be. So we have to get comfortable with the way we actually live in terms of how we tell stories about the past, which are that there are different narratives, even of the same event.
Is it hard for educators, do you think, to get their head around or to try to teach something with the understanding that it's fallible and that it's not 100% accurate, because they're trying to impart something to students as if it's something they have to learn and believe? If the kids are questioning the reliability of it, it might be more difficult to teach. I don't know. I'm just sort of spitballing here.
Yeah, for me, I mean, obviously at the college level, it's less about content and more about process. I'm trying to teach my students to be critical thinkers who can read evidence and read scholarship with a critical eye, and then develop their own arguments and interpretations based on evidence. And I think young children are also capable of that. So I partner a lot with McGraw-Hill. And some of the things we've talked about, for example, are creating timelines. You know, the idea that a timeline is not absolute. So a lot of the timelines we use to tell our history of the Jacksonville past are colonial, right? They start with the French. But if we look at an indigenous timeline, it doesn't start with the French. And in fact, the French don't begin a new chapter. They're part of a longer chapter of indigenous history. So even if we teach our students, our children, to look at their own timelines, they'll come up with different things, even though they're all in the same society, living in the same, community. And I don't think that's hard for children to grasp. And it's less about the content and more about the process. I mean, that's how I get around that.
I think it's also possible that, even if you're teaching younger children, as you're speaking about, like, even if when you're framing the lesson, you can just be like, this is what we know as of now. We learn new things every day. I mean, young children especially. So this is what we know as of now. 10 years from now, we might know more. People are constantly digging in the ground, looking for additional things, digging through archives, finding additional information. We may know more tomorrow. I am very hopeful that in 10 years from now, this podcast will be completely wrong, because we will know so much more about Indigenous history that it'll turn out that everything we said was 90% inaccurate, just because we didn't know. So that is my great hope, is that we get jostled by, historical discoveries, and people know enough that it turns out that we have a whole new narrative that we can spin.
Brendan, I'm going to ask you to respond to that. What happens if you're proven wrong about this entire endeavor of yours?
Well, I don't know that I'd be as excited about it as Jennifer sounds like she is, but it's very possible. This podcast is based on the best evidence we could find today. So I think it's about as accurate as it possibly can be. But as Jennifer says, what our understanding of history is constantly changing, and it's very possible that we'll learn in the coming years that some of what we share in this podcast is wrong. And if that's the case, maybe we'll have to come back and correct the record.
Well, I'd like to say a special thanks here to our guests, Dr. Denise Bossy, Jennifer Gray, Brendan Rivers on the line. Thank you all so much for sharing this story.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
You can find the Bygone Jax podcast at wjct.org/podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.